Here's a sobering question that deserves our attention. If international assistance actually delivered on its promises, wouldn't extreme poverty be history by now? Welcome to Econosphere, where we dive deep into the economic forces shaping our world. Today, we're tackling one of the most controversial topics in development economics: foreign aid and its complicated relationship with global poverty. Every single year, wealthy nations channel hundreds of billions of dollars toward developing countries. That's an astronomical sum of money, enough to fund entire space programs or rebuild massive infrastructure networks. Yet despite this enormous financial commitment spanning decades, nearly 700 million people still survive on less than $2.15 per day. What makes this even more puzzling is that some of the most dramatic poverty reductions we've witnessed recently happened in countries that received relatively modest amounts of international assistance. Think about China's remarkable economic transformation or Indonesia's rapid development. These success stories unfolded largely through domestic innovation and market-driven growth, not massive aid programs. Meanwhile, nations like Malawi in southern Africa or the Democratic Republic of Congo have been recipients of substantial aid flows for generations, yet they continue struggling with stagnant economic growth and persistent poverty. This creates an uncomfortable paradox that challenges our fundamental assumptions about how development actually works. Now, before we go further, let's acknowledge an important caveat. Countries don't end up on the receiving end of aid programs because everything's going smoothly. There's a selection bias at play here. It's like questioning whether emergency medical treatment works by noting that people in hospital emergency rooms are generally less healthy than those at home. The very factors that make countries aid recipients often make development more challenging. But this reality check doesn't eliminate the core question. Why hasn't this massive transfer of resources created the self-sustaining economic growth that aid advocates promised? Some economists go even further, arguing that foreign assistance has become part of the problem rather than the solution, creating dependencies that actually hinder long-term development. To understand this debate properly, we need to distinguish between different types of international assistance. Emergency humanitarian relief, the kind deployed after natural disasters or during conflicts, serves a completely different purpose than long-term development aid. Humanitarian assistance saves lives in crisis situations, and it's generally offered to any country facing emergencies, regardless of their development status. Our focus today is on development assistance, the systematic transfer of money, expertise, technology, and resources from wealthy economies to poorer ones with the explicit goal of fostering economic growth and improving living standards. This assistance sometimes comes as grants, sometimes as low-interest loans, and often with strings attached regarding policy reforms or governance changes. The theoretical foundation for development aid seemed rock solid when economists first articulated it decades ago. Picture a traditional agricultural economy where farmers produce just enough to feed their families, with nothing left over. This subsistence-level existence means minimal savings, which translates to almost no investment capital available for growth-generating activities like building factories, improving infrastructure, or expanding education systems. It's a classic catch-22 situation. You need investment to generate the income that enables saving, but you need savings to finance investment. This creates what economists call a poverty trap, a self-reinforcing cycle where low incomes prevent the investments necessary to increase incomes. Foreign aid was designed to break this cycle by providing the initial capital injection needed to jumpstart development. Think of it like helping a friend whose car battery has died. You provide the external power boost needed to get their engine running, but once it starts, their alternator takes over and they can drive independently. This logic seemed compelling, and it mirrors how venture capital helps startups become self-sustaining businesses. But economic theories, no matter how elegant, must prove themselves against real-world evidence. Fortunately, we have decades of data to examine how foreign aid has actually performed. The results are mixed in ways that should make us uncomfortable. On poverty reduction specifically, aid has achieved some genuine successes, particularly when targeted toward agriculture, healthcare, and education. Ethiopia's Productive Safety Net program has helped millions of rural families escape food insecurity while building infrastructure. Rwanda aid-supported health investments contributed to a 68% decline in child mortality between 2002 and 2012. Vietnam reduced its poverty rate from 50% in the 1990s to below 5% today, with World Bank assistance playing a significant role. These achievements represent real improvements in human welfare: fewer children dying from preventable diseases, families escaping hunger, communities gaining access to clean water and education. These outcomes matter enormously and shouldn't be dismissed. However, the broader picture remains troubling. Despite receiving over $1 trillion in development assistance since the 1960s, sub-Saharan Africa has actually seen its absolute number of people in extreme poverty increase. That's a staggering indictment of aid effectiveness at scale. But perhaps more revealing is what happens when we examine foreign aid's impact on economic growth, the engine that's supposed to drive countries out of aid dependency. Here, the evidence becomes quite stark. Researchers have conducted over 100 academic studies examining the relationship between aid and economic growth using 60 years of real-world data. A comprehensive review of this research published in 2010 found that development assistance has had a statistically insignificant effect on economic growth. Let that sink in. 6 decades of aid totaling trillions of dollars, and the best we can say is that it hasn't demonstrably helped recipient economies grow. This finding has prompted some of the world's most respected development economists to become vocal critics of traditional aid approaches. Their critiques have forced uncomfortable conversations about whether current aid systems might actually impede the development they're meant to promote. So why might giving countries money for investment, healthcare, and education fail to boost economic growth? The answer lies in understanding how aid often works in practice versus theory. One of the most significant problems is what economists call the substitution effect. Instead of supplementing domestic economic activity, aid frequently replaces it. When donor countries provide free or heavily subsidized goods, whether fertilizers, construction materials, or manufactured products, they flood local markets with items that local businesses might otherwise produce. Imagine you're a small-scale manufacturer in an aid recipient country, trying to build a business producing basic household goods. Suddenly, container ships arrive carrying thousands of free or nearly free versions of exactly what you make. Your potential customers no longer need to buy from you, your revenue disappears, and your business closes. Instead of fostering domestic industry, the aid has eliminated it. This isn't hypothetical. Africa's textile and clothing industry provides a stark example. As the continent became the largest destination for second-hand clothing donations from wealthy countries, local garment manufacturers faced impossible competition. Research published in the Economic Journal found that these clothing donations explained roughly half the job losses in Africa's apparel industry between 1981 and 2000. Now, there's nuance here. From a pure efficiency standpoint, why produce something locally when you can get it for free? those production resources could theoretically shift to more productive uses. The problem is that this reallocation often doesn't happen, or when it does, it pushes economies backward toward simpler activities like raw material extraction rather than forward toward more sophisticated manufacturing. The clothing situation became so problematic that the East African community banned second-hand clothing imports in 2015, and intra-African trade in used clothing was prohibited starting in 2023. These aren't theoretical policy debates, they represent desperate attempts to protect domestic industries from being killed by well-intentioned aid. The substitution problem extends beyond physical goods to services and technical assistance. Chinese infrastructure projects across Africa, often financed through development assistance programs, typically bring their own workers, managers, and technical experts. While these projects create impressive highways, bridges, and power plants, they provide limited learning opportunities for local workers. When the Chinese teams complete their projects and return home, they leave behind modern infrastructure but not the knowledge needed to build, maintain, or replicate it. The local workforce gains little experience with advanced construction techniques, project management, engineering solutions, or financial planning. This means the country remains dependent on foreign expertise for future infrastructure needs, perpetuating rather than reducing aid dependency. Recent surveys of African youth have highlighted growing frustration with this dynamic: foreign companies extracting resources or building infrastructure while providing minimal employment or skills transfer to local populations. But the problems run deeper than individual projects. The entire architecture of how aid gets delivered creates perverse incentives that work against effective development. When Western governments allocate billions for foreign assistance, most people assume that money flows directly to local organizations and communities that need it most. The reality is quite different. In 2024, only 12% of funds distributed by USAID, America's primary development agency, went directly to local frontline organizations in recipient countries. Instead, the vast majority flows to a handful of major consulting firms and contractors based in donor countries. These organizations then subcontract portions of the work, keeping substantial fees for themselves while passing along reduced amounts to actually implement projects on the ground. This system creates what critics call phantom aid, money that never actually enters the recipient country's economy because it gets spent on consultants, administrators, and overhead in the donor country. Data from the Center for Global Development shows that of the funds American organizations receive from USAID, only 14% ultimately reaches local frontline organizations. The contracting system creates additional problems through misaligned incentives. Most aid contracts reimburse organizations based on activities completed and time spent rather than results achieved. This creates what economists call a principal-agent problem. The contractors have incentives to maximize billable hours rather than maximize impact. The result is a development industry obsessed with process over outcomes. Projects become laden with elaborate planning documents, lengthy consultation processes, complex monitoring frameworks, and bureaucratic requirements that generate impressive reports but may not deliver meaningful results. USAID's own analysis found that almost half of their awarded contracts failed to achieve their intended objectives. This isn't to say that planning and oversight are unnecessary, they're essential for responsible use of public funds. But when process becomes an end in itself rather than a means to development outcomes, it diverts resources from actual implementation while creating lucrative work for consulting firms. Recognizing these systemic issues, some aid programs have experimented with more direct approaches. Conditional cash transfer programs like Brazil's Bolsa Familia and Mexico's Oportunidades provide money directly to poor families in exchange for keeping children in school and maintaining regular healthcare visits. These programs have shown success in reducing poverty and improving social outcomes. Even more radical are unconditional cash transfers that provide money directly to poor individuals with no strings attached. Research has demonstrated that people living in poverty generally make rational decisions about how to use additional income, typically investing in food security, education, healthcare, and productive assets rather than wasteful consumption. While these direct transfer approaches effectively reduce immediate poverty, they haven't proven capable of generating the broader economic transformations needed to eliminate aid dependency. The benefits tend to fade when the transfers end, suggesting they're more effective as social safety nets than as engines of economic development. Perhaps the most commonly cited explanation for aid's limited effectiveness is corruption, the idea that weak institutions in recipient countries allow political elites to steal aid money for personal benefit. There are certainly documented cases of aid funds being embezzled, and politicians who can siphon off aid have perverse incentives to keep their populations poor to justify continued assistance. However, research suggests corruption may be less significant than commonly assumed. A World Bank study found that while aid disbursements to aid-dependent countries did coincide with increases in deposits at offshore banks, the leakage amounted to about 7.5%, significant but not devastating. Some studies even suggest that aid reduces corruption in recipient countries by strengthening oversight mechanisms. More subtle but perhaps more damaging is how aid can undermine government effectiveness even without outright corruption. When governments can fund their operations through aid rather than domestic taxation, they become less accountable to their citizens and less motivated to build effective tax collection systems. This weakens the social contract between governments and citizens while reinforcing aid dependency. Taking a step back, we should acknowledge that the effectiveness of aid was always likely to decline over time. Early aid programs could focus on countries with relatively favorable conditions for development, adequate infrastructure, reasonable governance, and social stability. As these easier cases graduated from aid dependence, the remaining recipients increasingly included countries with more challenging circumstances. There's a cruel paradox here. The countries that most desperately need assistance often have the least favorable conditions for aid to succeed. Syria, Afghanistan, and Sudan face combinations of conflict, ethnic tension, weak institutions, and geographic challenges that make effective development extremely difficult regardless of funding levels. This doesn't mean foreign aid is entirely hopeless. Recent economic growth in several sub-Saharan African countries, particularly those with diversified economies, suggests that well-designed assistance can contribute to positive outcomes under the right circumstances. The question isn't whether aid can work, but when and how. Looking ahead, the international development sector faces an existential crisis. Political movements emphasizing economic nationalism and government efficiency are driving massive cuts to aid budgets. The United States is considering reductions of up to 90% in some aid programs, while European countries are redirecting funds from development assistance to defense spending. This represents the first large-scale pullback of foreign aid in modern history, and the consequences are already becoming visible. Essential services like vaccination programs, maternal health initiatives, and disease prevention efforts are being disrupted. Humanitarian organizations are straining to maintain support for vulnerable populations, and there's no question that these cuts will cost lives and push millions of people back into extreme poverty. The human cost of this transition will be severe, particularly for countries and communities that have become dependent on aid for basic services. In some cases, aid withdrawal could contribute to political instability and conflict, creating regional security challenges that ultimately cost more to address than continued development assistance. However, for countries able to manage the transition effectively, there may be opportunities within this crisis. Reduced aid flows could create space for local businesses, industries, and supply chains to develop without competing against free or subsidized imports. Governments will need to become more capable at designing fair tax systems and efficient spending programs, potentially leading to stronger institutions and reduced corruption. The shift from aid dependency to domestic resource mobilization could also restore the social contract between governments and citizens. When governments depend on aid rather than taxes, they primarily serve donor interests rather than citizen needs. Self-funding governments must be more responsive and accountable to the people they govern. But perhaps most significantly, the retreat of Western aid may create a vacuum that other global powers are eager to fill. Foreign aid has never been purely philanthropic. It's been a tool of soft power and international influence since the United States established USAID in 1961. If Western countries abandon this tool, how will it affect international alliances, democratic governance, and security in strategically important regions like Africa, where China and Russia already maintain strong diplomatic ties? The answers to these questions will shape not just the future of development but the balance of global power itself. As we've seen throughout this analysis, foreign aid embodies fundamental tensions between good intentions and complex realities, between immediate needs and long-term solutions, between local autonomy and external support. What's clear is that the current system isn't working as intended. Despite enormous financial commitments and genuine successes in specific areas, traditional aid approaches haven't generated the self-sustaining economic growth needed to eliminate global poverty. The challenge moving forward is designing better systems that build local capacity rather than replacing it, that focus on results rather than process, and that gradually work themselves out of existence rather than perpetuating dependency. This won't be easy. It requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about how aid systems actually function versus how they're supposed to work. It means prioritizing effectiveness over good intentions, and long-term development over short-term political gains. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the people living in poverty are not passive recipients of assistance but active agents of their own development who need support and opportunity rather than dependency. The stakes couldn't be higher. With hundreds of millions of people still living in extreme poverty and traditional aid approaches under unprecedented pressure, we need new thinking about how wealthy and poor countries can work together more effectively. The alternative, abandoning the world's poorest populations to fend for themselves while global inequalities continue widening, is morally unacceptable and strategically dangerous. The foreign aid paradox teaches us that good intentions aren't enough. Effective development requires understanding complex economic and political realities, designing systems with appropriate incentives, and maintaining focus on long-term capacity building rather than short-term dependency creation. Whether we can learn these lessons and implement better approaches may determine not just the future of global poverty but the stability and security of our interconnected world. Thanks for joining us on Econosphere today. This topic deserves continued attention as these policies affect millions of lives around the world. What aspects of foreign aid effectiveness do you think deserve more scrutiny? Share your thoughts in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video.